November 12, 1943, 2:18 a.m., the North Atlantic. The air inside U-537 is thick with a stench of diesel, unwashed bodies, and fear. The sonar operator, Fenric Eel, rips his headphones off, his face pale in the red glow of the control room. ASDIC contact close starboard side. Kapitan Lieutenant Peter Shrew grips the periscope handles. Rig for silent running. Flood negative. Take us to 200 mil, Schnell. The boat angles down, a cramped steel coffin descending into the crushing black. Then it comes the high-pitched metallic ping-ping-ping of the hunter. Oberbootsmart Chief Petty Officer Karl Hoffmann, gripping a valve wheel, begins to sweat. He is a 24-year-old veteran of 3 patrols, but this sound always turns his blood to ice. The ping is the sound of an invisible finger pointing directly at them. They are right on top of us. Herr Callion, the Sona man whispers. The first explosion is a deafening wet concussion that slams the U-boat sideways. Lights shatter. Cork insulation rains down. A new sound. The shriek of stressed metal. Whump, crunch. Another charge. Closer. The boat groans like a dying animal. Water sprays from a ruptured pipe in the engine room. Depth 220 m, the chief engineer screams. The off-torpedo room is flooding. We can't hold her. Shrew is calm, but his knuckles are white. They have us. We are too deep, too damaged. Surface, surface, blow all tanks. The sickening lurch of the emergency ascent. The crew clings to anything solid as the boat rockets toward the surface. A wounded whale desperate for air. Karl Hoffmann braces for the gunfire he knows will come. The hatch flies open. Karl scrambles up the ladder behind his captain, bursting onto the slick deck. The air is freezing, tasting of salt and cordite. And then the light. A blinding white beam pins them from the darkness. It's coming from the high steel gray cliff of a destroyer bearing down on them. A voice amplified by a bullhorn cuts through the wind in English. Do not attempt to scuttle. Abandon your vessel, I say again. Abandon your vessel. We are preparing to fire. Karl looks at his captain, who simply raises his hands. The fight is over. He slides into the black, churning water. The cold is a physical blow, stealing his breath. A rope is thrown. He is hauled, gasping and shivering, onto the deck of the destroyer. He sees the ship's name painted on a life ring. HMS St. Croix, a Canadian sailor built like a lumberjack, shoves a rough blanket into his chest. Get below now. There is no rifle butt to the face. No spit, no triumphant kick. Karl and his surviving crewmates are herded into a warm mess deck where they collapse in shock, dripping theater onto the linoleum. A medic checks them for wounds. It is efficient, businesslike. This is the first psychological shock. They were warriors of the Reich, the wolves of the sea. They were prepared for a hateful, vengeful enemy. They were not prepared for this cold, almost bored, professionalism. Days later, they are landed at Halifax, Nova Scotia, a sprawling gray port choked with warships. They are marched alongside thousands of others into a processing depot. Karl is staggered by the variety of uniforms. He sees the sun-baked tunics of the Deutsches Afrika Korps captured in Tunisia. He sees Fallschirmjäger paratroopers from Sicily. He sees Luftwaffe ground crews from France. They are a broken army. All funneled to this strange new continent. Here they meet their permanent guards, the Veterans Guard of Canada. Karl watches them confused. These are not the elite stormtroopers he was told defended the Allied homelands. These are old men. Their faces are lined, their hair gray. Many wear ribbons from a war Karl only read about in books. Vimy Passendale, 1918. They walk with limps. They smoke pipes. A Wehrmacht Hauptmann captain. Stiff-backed and arrogant even in his torn uniform, clicks his heels and demands to speak to the camp commandant. A grizzled Canadian sergeant who looks to be at least 60. Chews on his pipe stem and looks the captain up and down. That's Major Pellier, sir, the sergeant says, his voice growly. and he'll see you when he's ready. Until then, you'll stand here with the rest." The headman sputters. "I am a German officer." "I demand, and I," the sergeant interrupts, his voice never rising, "am Sergeant Frank McBride, and I demand you shut your hole. You're not in France anymore, son. You're in Nova Scotia now. Form up by threes. The politeness is a weapon. It is disarming." The prisoners are braced for brutality which would validate their Nazi propaganda. They are met instead with rules, with orderly, mundane, and unshakable authority. It is profoundly unsettling. They are marched to a railway station. Karl expects cattle cars. They are, after all, prisoners, the enemy. Instead, they are loaded onto colonist cars, old but functional passenger trains, wooden benches, a pot-bellied stove in the center, and windows. They are given rations for the journey, tins of corned beef, heart attack biscuits, and a large metal drum of hot, sweet tea. A guard from the Veterans Guard moves down the aisle, handing 2 cigarettes to each German NCO. "Don't smoke them all at once, boys," he says with a thin smile. "It's a long trip." The train gives a heavy jolt and begins to move. Karl Hoffman presses his face to the dirty glass, watching the gray city of Halifax recede. He's moving west. He knows nothing of this country. In his mind, Canada is a fiction, a vast frozen wasteland attached to America. He and the other PWS, men who had conquered Europe, assume they will be in a new city by nightfall. The train picks up speed. Karl watches the landscape begin to change. The sparse coastal settlements give way to trees. Just trees. A dense, unbroken forest of pine and spruce stretching from the tracks to the horizon. Hours pass. The sun shifts. The train clatters on. Karl looks out the window. Trees. He dozes off, his head rattling against the wooden wall. He wakes hours later. The sun is setting. He looks out the window. There is nothing. Nothing but trees and rocks and lakes. An endless, empty, magnificent, and terrifying wilderness. A soldier from the Africa Corps. A young man named Ga stares out the same window, his eyes wide. "Huisha," he whispers. "Where are the cities?" Karl looks at him. "Where are the farms? Where are the people?" The train whistles, a lonely, mournful sound that echoes and dies in the vast, dark emptiness. The realization is just beginning to dawn. They are not just being imprisoned. They are being swallowed. The train ride becomes a form of temporal distortion. One day passes, then 2. They cross from Nova Scotia through New Brunswick and into the vastness of Quebec. The Wehrmacht Hutman tries to maintain discipline, ordering his section to perform calisthenics in the aisle. The Canadian Guards, Sergeant McBride among them, simply watch, sipping their own tea, their expressions unreadable. They don't interfere. They don't need to. The train is a sealed world rattling through a void. By the 3rd day, the prisoners' conversations have faded. The arrogance is gone, replaced by a sullen, bewildered silence. They are deep in Ontario, a province Karl Hoffman has never heard of, but which seems impossibly to be larger than Germany itself. "This is a trick," a young Luftwaffe pilot mutters to Karl, his face pressed to the glass. "They are driving us in circles. No country can be this. This nothing." Karl shakes his head. The sun is constant. "Hans, we are still moving west. Look," he points. The landscape hasn't just been trees for a day. It has changed. Now it is a brutal alien world of black rock, sharp cliffs and stunted wind-blasted pines, the Canadian Shield. There are no farms. God, the Africa Corps man says. His voice is hollow. He is used to the desert, but that was a desert of sand. This is a desert of stone and water. Nothing can live here. Where are they taking us? The train passes a lake. An hour later, it passes another and another. These are not lakes. They are inland seas of cold, dark water stretching to horizons of their own. The sheer raw emptiness of the land begins to feel like an active, hostile force. In Europe, escape was a matter of navigating people, towns, and borders. Here, Carl realizes the very concept of escape is a joke. To where? Sergeant McBride walks down the aisle, checking the stove. The headman, desperate to exert control, stands. Sergeant, we demand to know our destination. This is a violation of the Geneva Convention. We are being transported to nowhere. McBride finishes tapping his pipe and looks at the German officer. He seems for the first time almost amused. Violation? He chuckles, a dry, rasping sound. Son, you're not even in northern Ontario yet. You've got another day to go. He unfolds a simple paper map from his pocket and flattens it on his knee. The Germans crowd the aisle to look. McBride points with his pipe stem. We started here, Halifax. His finger moves a tiny fraction of an inch. We're about here. He gestures to the vast blank white space that covers the rest of the map. And we're taking you here. His finger lands on a tiny, insignificant dot on the northernmost shore of Lake Superior, next to a town called NY. The headman's face drains of color. The map shows their journey so far has been a mere crawl from the eastern edge. There are insects being carried across a continent. The polite guard hasn't just answered his question. He has, with a simple piece of paper, utterly dismantled the officer's worldview. The prisoners return to their seats. The psychological blow is more effective than a beating. They are for the first time truly insignificant. On the fourth day, the train finally slows, its brakes screeching in the immense silence. Right, lads. End of the line. Everybody out. Carl Hoffman steps down from the train, his legs stiff. The air is different here. It's so clean and cold it stings his lungs. And the sound, there is none. Only the wind whistling through the pines and a low, distant roar. He looks around. There is no station. There is no town. There is only a rough wooden platform, a siding, and a muddy track leading into the forest. In the distance, he sees it. Camp 100, Neys. It is brand new. The raw yellow wounds of cut lumber stark against the dark green of the forest. Rows of wooden barracks, a cookhouse, and a hospital, all surrounded by two massive fences of barbed wire with wooden guard towers at each corner. It is a prison identical to 100 others they have seen or heard of, but the context is what breaks them. Behind the camp, the forest looms like a solid 1,000 ft high green wall. It is not the managed, civilized forest of the Schwarzwald. It is a tangled primeval mass of spruce, birch, and rock. And in front of the camp, through a break in the trees, Carl sees the source of the roar. He walks mesmerized with the other prisoners as they are herded toward the gate. He sees Lake Superior. It is not a lake. It is an ocean. A freshwater sea of churning, gray, lethally cold water that disappears into a horizon as flat and absolute as the Atlantic. A young Panzer Grenadier drops his small bundle. Another ocean, he whispers, his voice breaking. We cross the ocean to get to another ocean. They are marched through the gates. The guards of the Veterans Guard motion them into assembly. The camp commandant, a tall, thin major with the same weary 1918 ribbons as his men, stands on the steps of the Messole. Welcome to Nazi, gentlemen, he says, his voice carrying easily in the clear air. He speaks passable, formal German. You are prisoners of war under the authority of His Majesty King George VI. You will be treated in strict accordance with the Geneva Convention. You will work. You will be fed. You will be housed. He pauses and looks past them out toward the impenetrable forest, and then to the deadly expanse of the lake. We have rules here, the major continues, but I advise you to look around. You will find that he gestures to his elderly guards, who stand relaxed, rifles slung over their shoulders. are not your primary jailers. This, he sweeps his arm at the wilderness, is your prison. There are no towns for 300 kilometers. There are no farms. There is only rock, water, and flies. Attempting escape is not brave. It is suicide. We will not hunt you. We will simply collect your bodies in the spring. The speech is delivered not as a threat, but as a simple, polite statement of fact. Karl Hoffmann is assigned to Hut 27. He sits on his cot, a wooden frame with a straw-filled mattress, and stares at the new cut pine of the wall. The propaganda had told them of the subhuman, brutal Canadians. Instead, they were being guarded by polite, aging fathers who treated them not with hatred, but with a kind of weary pity. The propaganda had told them they were conquering the world. Instead, they had been shipped to a place that the world had forgotten, a place where the land itself, in its vast, silent indifference, was the true prison. The war, the Reich, the Führer, it all felt impossibly far away. The days at Camp 1009 settle into a routine that is both mundane and deeply surreal. The first most jarring element is the food. Greiter, Corporal Gunter, the veteran from the Africa Corps, weeps openly on the first morning. Karl Hoffmann finds him in the Messole, staring at his plate. "Look," Gunter whispers, his voice thick. Karl looks. On the metal tray are 2 thick slices of white bread, a generous smear of real butter, a glistening square of raspberry jam, 2 fried eggs, 3 strips of bacon, and a steaming mug of dark, sweet coffee. It is more than my wife has seen in a year," Ga says, horrified. "They are mocking us." But it is not a mockery. It is simply the ration. They are fed better than they had been as frontline soldiers in the Wehrmacht. They are fed better. They know than their own families back in a bomb-ravaged Germany. This generosity is more psychologically crippling than a ration of stale bread and thin soup. Brutality. They could understand it was the currency of war, but kindness, abundance, it is a disorienting, subversive weapon. They are issued work clothing, heavy wool trousers, flannel shirts, and tough leather boots. All Canadian-made, all warm. They are organized into work details under the terms of the convention as NCOs. Karl and his comrades are not required to work, but the camp commandant has a simple, polite policy. "Gentlemen," Major Pellier addresses them, "you are correct. Your rank exempts you from labor. You are free to remain in your barracks." He lets the silence hang. However, only those who volunteer for labor will receive the full workers' ration tie. That includes the cigarettes, the jam, the chocolate, and the extra bread. Those who choose not to work will receive the basic ration as stipulated by the convention. He doesn't need to elaborate. The basic ration is survival. The workers' ration is comfort. The next day, Karl Hoffmann, along with 90% of the other NCOs, volunteers to work. Their job is as vast and incomprehensible as the landscape itself, cutting pulpwood. They are marched out of the wire every morning, under the lax, almost sleepy gaze of the veterans' guard. The old soldiers don't march them at gunpoint. They simply walk with them, rifles slung, smoking their pipes. The prisoners are handed axes and two-man crosscut saws known as misery whips. Their task is to attack the endless, silent forest. Whack, whack, whack. The sound of axes echoes in the cold, clear air. Carr, a U-boat machinist, is clumsy at first. His hands, accustomed to delicate valve work and greasy machinery, are soft. Within an hour they are raw. Within a day they are blistered and bleeding. He works alongside a Folger named Eric, a man who had jumped into sight. They stare at a single towering spruce. In this country, Eric grunts, spitting on his hands. Even the trees are arrogant. They pull the crosscut saw back and forth. Zing, shush, zing, shush. The smell of pine resin is sharp like antiseptic. Sergeant McBride, their guard for the day, sits on a stump 20 yards away, cleaning his pipe with a penknife. He watches them, but not like a hawk. He watches them like a farmer watches his cattle, a detached, proprietary presence. The helped man, the arrogant officer from the train, refuses to work. He spends his days pacing the compound, a solitary, furious figure slowly starving his pride as he watches the workers return with their extra rations. The guard's politeness is a constant source of confusion. One afternoon, Carl's axe head, poorly wedged, flies off the handle and sails into a deep snowdrift. He freezes. In the Wehrmacht, losing or breaking equipment meant a severe dressing down, perhaps a formal charge. He approaches Sergeant McBride, his heart pounding, standing at attention. Sergeant Gerrit Hoffman reports, I have lost the head of my axe. McBride looks up slowly, squinting. Lost it? Where? In the snow. Sir, over there. I cannot find it. McBride sighs, not in anger, but in simple, weary frustration. Right. Well, you can't bloody well cut wood without it, can you? He stands up, knocking his pipe against his heel. Show me where. For 10 minutes, the two of them, the Canadian guard and the German prisoner, through the snow, prodding with sticks until McBride's boot hits something hard. He reaches down and pulls up the steel axe head. There now, he says, handing it to Carl. You take this back to the tool shed, get Corporal Dubois to rehang it, and try not to throw it at a bloody moose next time, eh? Carl is stunned. That is all. Herr Sergeant. McBride looks at him baffled. What else is there? Go on. Get. Carl retreats, his mind reeling. No shouting, no punishment. Just a practical problem stated and solved. This lack of overt hostility is maddening. It gives them nothing to push against, nothing to hate. The guards treat them not as monsters, but as a combination of dangerous children and inconvenient long-term employees. The prisoners in turns begin to change. The rigid Wehrmacht discipline, which the Hullman tries so desperately to enforce, begins to erode. What is the point of a sharp salute of polished boots when your guard is a 60-year-old man who calls you son and is more concerned with his pipe tobacco than your ideology? They begin to build not just cut with the Canadians' tacit permission. They construct a small theater, a sports field, even a complex multi-tiered bake oven. They form an orchestra. They put on plays by Schiller and Goethe. They are creating a miniature Germany in the middle of a vast, unfeeling void. But the void is always there. One evening, Carl stands at the barbed wire fence, looking out. The sun is setting over Lake Superior, turning the ice-choked water into a sea of liquid fire. It is the most beautiful and the most terrifying thing he has ever seen. The sheer scale of it. Back home, Germany was a land of borders, of history, of people. Every square meter was known, farmed, or fought over. This was creation itself, untouched, unblemished, and utterly indifferent to him, to his war, to his entire continent. He thinks of escape. He pictures himself walking into that forest. He would be dead in 2 days, eaten by black flies, lost in 1,000 square kilometers of identical trees or frozen solid. He turns and looks at the guard tower. The old veteran inside is not even looking at him. He is reading a newspaper. Carl realizes the major was right. The barbed wire isn't there to keep them in. It's there to keep the wilderness out. The guards are not their jailers. They are their protectors. This realization is the final crushing psychological blow. He's not a prisoner of war. He is a refugee saved from the war and kept safe from the world by a polite old man with a rifle. February 9th, 1944, 07 a.m., Camp 100 Neys. The world is gone. Carl Hoffman steps out of Hut 27 into an atmosphere of pure, sharp crystal. It is 42 degrees below zero. The air is so cold, it doesn't feel like air. It is a physical, abrasive substance. To breathe it in too quickly, is to feel 1,000 tiny needles drive into his lungs. The sound of the riel bugle cracks and shatters in the stillness. The entire camp is buried. Snow is piled in drifts higher than the barracks, forming surreal white canyons. The paths have been dug out, but the camp itself feels subterranean. The sky is a pale, merciless blue. Lake Superior, now a vast frozen plate of white pressure ridges, groans and booms in the distance, a deep, resonant thump as the ice shifts. A sound like artillery from a frozen god. This is the true jailer. Inside the mess hall, the air is thick with the fog of hot coffee, frying pork, and wet wool. The prisoners huddle, their faces ruddy, their conversations subdued. A young Lanza, a new arrival from the failed defense of Italy, is rocking back and forth, his hands wrapped around his mug. "We will die here," he mutters, his eyes wide with a terror Carl recognizes. "They brought us here to freeze. This is their plan." Sergeant McBride, making his morning rounds, overhears him. He stops, not to punish, but to correct, as one would a child. "Nonsense, son," McBride says, his voice perfectly reasonable. He gestures to the pot-bellied stove in the corner, glowing a dull red. "You've got 3 or more of a cord of birch stacked outside your hut. You've got long underwear. You've got 4,000 calories on that plate. You're better off than I am. My wife's furnace in Aurelia is on the fritz." He claps the kid on the shoulder. "Eat your eggs. Work keeps you warm." The young soldier stares, speechless. The guard has not only dismissed his existential terror, but has complained about his own domestic problems. The work has impossibly continued. The prisoners are now skidding the logs they've cut, dragging them with draft horses provided by the Canadian Army down to the frozen lake to be floated to the pulp mill in the spring. Carl, now hardened and sinewy, his hands calloused like wood, has become an expert woodsman. He finds he enjoys it. The physical exhaustion, the quantifiable result of a day's labor, the silence, the helped man does not. The officer, Lieutenant Colonel Obestitant Hannes Fall, is a ghost. He still refuses to work, clinging to the tatters of his rank. But the Canadian commandant has held to his polite rule. Verdal receives the basic ration. He is thin, his uniform hangs on him, and he is perpetually cold. He emerges from his hut, his face blue, his great coat wrapped tight. He sees Carl and his team preparing the horses. "Hoffman." Verrill barks, his voice thin in the vast cold. "Your posture is lax. You are a disgrace to the Kriegsmarine. You will stand aside, Herr Obstleutnant." Carl says, not unkindly, he doesn't even salute, "You are in the way of the harness." Verdal's eyes go wide. It is the ultimate insubordination. He has no recourse. He cannot send Carl to the stockade. Only the Canadians can do that. He cannot reduce his rations. He cannot assign him latrine duty. He has no power here. The old structures of the Wehrmacht have been frozen, shattered, and blown away by the Ontario winter. The new hierarchy is simple. There are the Canadians who have the food and the warmth, and there are the prisoners who must earn it. Fergal turns his face a mask of impotent rage and retreats to his cold, empty hut. He's no longer a leader. He's just a man who is hungry. The guards observe all of this with quiet detachment. They run the camp not as a military prison, but as a remote lumber company. One afternoon, Eric the Falcher Jagger misjudges a swing. The axe skips off a knot on a frozen log and bites deep into his own boot. He screams. It is a raw, terrifying sound in the silent forest. Carl and the others pack the wound with snow, fashioning a tourniquet from a torn shirt. They carry him back to the wire. The guard in the tower, an old corporal named Smokey, sees them coming. He doesn't aim his rifle. He climbs down, unlatches the gate, and runs to help them carry Eric. "God damn it," Smokey mutters, seeing the blood-soaked boot. "That's the third one this month. You boys got to be more careful. That ice makes the steel bounce." He's not angry. He is annoyed. It is an industrial accident. It creates paperwork. Eric is taken to the camp hospital, which is cleaner and better stocked than the field station he'd seen in Sicily. The Canadian doctor, a captain, saves his foot. He spends the next 2 months in recovery, reading and learning English from a nurse. The war, meanwhile, has become a ghost story. In June 1944, the camp receives newspapers. The headlines are enormous. Invasion. Allies land in Normandy. Karl, Gunter, and the others huddle around the paper in the Mosole. They read the names of French towns they had occupied. Now rubble. They see the lists of captured German divisions. There is no cheering, no Heil Hitler, only a profound, heavy silence. They are dying, Gah whispers, his face gray. He is staring at a photo of a destroyed Panzer near Cole. All of them. They're all dying. Karl looks out the window, past the wire to the green, indifferent forest, now teeming with summer life. The war is on another planet. The battles, the blood, the Führer. It all feels like a faint fever dream. Here, the only enemies are the black flies and the mosquitoes. Here, the only objective is to stack the day's quota of wood to earn the ration to get a seat at the orchestra's performance of Beethoven. A new batch of prisoners arrives in late 1944. These are not the professionals of 42 and 43. They are hollow-eyed, fanatical boys from the Hitler Jugend and old, terrified men from the Volkster. They try to impose the Nazi salute. They call Karl and the others traitors for their casual working relationship with the guards. "You are collaborators." One 17-year-old SS Schützer screams at Karl. "You fraternize with the enemy." Karl, who now weighs 20 lb more than when he was captured, who has muscles he never knew he had, simply looks at the boy, the enemy. Karl says, "Gave me this apple." He takes a bite. "They gave me this wool blanket. The enemy younger is the only reason you will survive the winter." The boy is speechless. His fanaticism has no purchase here. It cannot compete with a full stomach and the crushing, silent, apolitical presence of the Canadian Shield. The politeness of the guards combined with the tyranny of the geography has done what no bombing campaign could. It hasn't just defeated them. It has erased them. It has rendered their entire identity as Herrenvolk, as soldiers of the Reich, utterly, politely, and irreversibly absurd. May 8, 1945, 11 hours a.m., Camp 100 Neys. The sound of the great unraveling has haunted the camp for weeks. It is the sound of spring on Lake Superior, a cacophony of pistol shot cracks, deep groaning booms, and the sound of continents of ice grinding against the shore. The lake is breaking up. A whistle blows, not for the work detail. A full assembly. The prisoners file out onto the muddy parade ground, blinking in the bright, watery sunlight. The smell is of damp earth, thawing pine needles, and the vast, cold water. Major Pelletier, the commandant, stands on the steps of the main hall. He is not flanked by armed guards. He is just there holding a single sheet of paper. The camp falls silent. Even the SS fanatics, the blacks as they're known, seem to sense the gravity. Pellier waits, letting the silence stretch, broken only by the drip of water from the eaves. "Gentlemen," he begins. His voice is flat, devoid of triumph. "I have an announcement from Allied Supreme Command." He raises the paper. As of 2301 Central European Time, May 7th, all forces of the German High Command have surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe is over. The silence that follows is not human. It is the silence of the wilderness itself. A vast, crushing vacuum. Karl Hoffmann stands frozen. He feels the light spring breeze on his face. He hears a single woodpecker hammering at a tree just outside the wire. The war is over. The words don't make sense. The war was the world. It was the axis on which his entire life had turned. Here in this place, it had become a distant radio signal. Now that signal had been switched off. A single shrill voice shatters the quiet. It is the 17-year-old SS Schützer from the Wulderm. His face is a mask of white fanatical rage, his eyes streaming tears. Luge, he screams, his voice cracking. Lies, it is a trick. The Führer lives. The Wunderwaffe are coming. You are liars. He lunges not at a guard, but at Ga, the Africa Corps veteran standing next to him. Traitor. You believe this? Before he can take 2 steps. Sergeant McBride, who had been leaning against a post, moves with a speed that belies his age. He doesn't draw his weapon. He simply grabs the boy by the front of his tunic, lifting him half off the ground. McBride's face is inches from the boy's. His voice is not a shout. It is a low, cold growl. The war, he hisses, is over. You lost. Your Führer put a bullet in his own head in a bunker in Berlin. Your 1,000-year Reich is a pile of bricks. He shoves the boy, who stumbles and falls into the mud, sobbing. McBride looks up at the rest of the prisoners, his eyes sweeping over them. Anyone else? No one moves. The headman, Hannes Fahl, stares at his boots, his face hollow, his pride, his rank, his entire purpose. All of it had been built on a foundation that was now officially gone. He is just a cold, hungry man in a tattered uniform in the middle of a Canadian forest. Pellier lets the scene play out, then clears his throat. You are no longer prisoners of war. He continues as if nothing had happened. You are now classified as surrendered enemy personnel. You will remain in this facility pending repatriation. He folds the paper. The whistle for the midday meal will blow in 10 minutes. Dismissed. And that is it. There is no celebration from the Canadians. No taunting, no triumphant hoisting of a flag. The war did not end with a baying. It ended with a polite announcement followed by the promise of lunch. Karl walks back to Hut 27 in a daze. Gunther walks beside him, his shoulders slumped. It is finished, Gunther whispers. He pulls a worn photo from his breast pocket. It is of his wife and 2 small children standing in front of a church in Dresden. Are they still there, Karl? Is Dresden still there? Karl has no answer. He realizes with a cold dread that his own polite, comfortable, well-fed imprisonment has been a grotesque mercy. While he was learning to swing an axe and complaining about the cold, his entire country was being incinerated. The news transforms the camp, the hardcore Nazis. Perhaps 24 of them become a sullen, isolated faction. They hold their own funerals for the Führer, marching in the woods, singing songs of the S. The Canadian guards watch them and do nothing. Let him sing, Smokey tells Karl as they watch the fanatics file past. So long as they meet their pulp quota, they can yodel to the moon for all I care. This indifference is the final, most profound humiliation. Their fanaticism, their world-changing ideology is treated as a harmless, slightly eccentric hobby by their jailers. The work continues. This perhaps is the strangest part, but the war is over. Eric, the false Schurger, protests the next morning as the guards hand out the sores. Sergeant McBride sips his tea from a metal mug. That's right, son. So why are we cutting wood? McBride looks at him as if he's an idiot. Because the contract with the Superior Pulp and Paper Mill doesn't expire until 1946. You're still getting paid, aren't you? You're still eating, aren't you? Well, someone's got to cut the wood. Get to it. Karl shoulders his axe. He walks into the forest, a place that is no longer a prison, but simply his workplace. He is no longer a soldier of the Reich. He is no longer a prisoner of war. He is a lumberjack, a well-fed, well-paid, displaced employee of the Canadian government. He stands before a massive white pine. He spits on his hands, grips the axe handle, and swings. The clean thack echoes in the silent, indifferent forest. He had been captured by an enemy that confused him. He had been imprisoned by a geography that terrified him. And in the end, He had been defeated not by violence but by polite, bureaucratic, overwhelming normally.